Yay. Volume off so we don't get any stuff. And how do I do a chat thingy? Chat note. Jay, any ideas?
Should I say something? Here we go.
There we go. How do I see if I can figure that out. Anyway, welcome everyone. Let's put this back so we can see what's going on. Okay. So welcome everyone to Revisiting Democracy, the video podcast launch with guest Alan Maleche, Executive Director of Kellen in Kenya, and other guests who will be with us, and co-hosted by Anne-Christine Dedesky and J.W. Walker of the Stop the Coup 2025 campaign. So yes, this is the second edition of Stop the Coup here at the Bureau. And we've got more planned, 2 in September, 2 in October, and then I think just 1 in November.
Yeah,
Yes.
and 1 in December.
Right after the election. So, a little bit on our minds. My name is Greg Newton. I am the co-founder of the Bureau of General Services Queer Division, along with my beloved partner, Tony Jokum. We founded the Bureau back in 2012, and we've been here at the LGBT Community Center since 2014. If you're not on our email list and you would like to be, you can sign up for that on our website, bgsqd.com. And you can also check out the events calendar there. It's quite slow for the rest of August, although we do have 2 things happening on Saturday, so check that out. But in September, we've got something going on pretty much every day. We have a busy calendar coming up. So please check that out. The only other thing I'll say about the Bureau is our hours are Wednesdays through Sundays from 1 to 7 p.m. And then sometimes we stay open late if we have an event. So before I hand it over to Jay and AC, I wanted to read a land acknowledgement and a call for a ceasefire in Gaza. So the Bureau acknowledges that our organization operates on the unceded land of the Munsee Lenape. We encourage you to join the Bureau in signing up to make a monthly donation to the American Indian Community Houses Mannahatta Fund. The Mannahatta Fund, according to its website, is an invitation to all settlers and non-native people who wish to acknowledge the legacy of theft and genocide that comprise the history of New York City and the United States. And you can find out more at mannahattafund.org. We also want to recognize that today, August 8th, is the 308th day of Israel's genocidal campaign against the Palestinian people, funded by our tax dollars and enabled by our government's unwavering support. We hope that you will join us in calling for an immediate permanent ceasefire, the release of all detainees held by Israel, the release of all hostages held by Hamas, an end to the siege of Gaza, and an end to the Israeli occupation of Palestinian territories in order to stop the collective punishment of Palestinians and to ensure the swift delivery of desperately needed food, water, medicine, fuel, and humanitarian aid to the people of Gaza. Our greater hope is for peace, justice, and liberation from oppression for all people everywhere. So thank you for coming tonight, those of you joining us online and those of you in person. And I hand it over to Jay and to AC, and let's go.
Thank you very much, Greg. Yes, I am alone here at the Bureau of General Services from the Stop the Coup team. Our amazing founder, AC, has been traveling the world, spreading the word about Project 2025, and has now returned to the United States. She's in New Orleans right now. But there's a lot to talk about. There's a lot going on in the news. There's a lot that's been happening with our Stop the Coup 2025 campaign. So let's get things started. Hey, AC, good to have you back in the States.
Thank you. And I wish I was in New York City because I'm sitting in about 98-degree weather over here. However, it's always good to be in the South. And And I was just in Europe, and yes, Project 2025, the word is getting out, but globally, we still have a lot of work to do to talk about it. So I'm glad we're going to have a chance, but I want to hear about what's happening and what just happened in New York City. I know that you were working on a campaign and an action when I was in Europe. And so what I thought was, why don't we catch people up just a little bit about what's happening with Project 2025, first of all, I thought, and then let's talk about our actions and our campaign, you know?
Yes, absolutely. Yeah, sure. Do you want me to start?
So, well, one of the things I wanted just to say is that, because a lot of people are asking me this right away, is that they've seen headlines that suggest that Project 2025 is closing shop because there were some denials
And
by
the crowd
President Trump.
laughed.
And of course, as many people know, there was what we believe was probably the forced demission of one of Project 2025's people. And so what's happening right now is really just to say that Project 2025 is still very actively moving forward. It has been certainly denounced in some ways by primarily the Trump campaign, but other revelations have come forward, in fact, reconfirming what we already knew, which was that this is a conservative movement manifesto and plan, and that the people who are in the leadership of the Republican campaign, including obviously the Trump campaign, have been very familiar and knowledgeable about this campaign for a period of time. But I just want to talk about it because one of the things that's been happening is, and I think that this is where our campaign comes in and others, is that we are really succeeding in many ways. Our mission with this campaign, when we started in November and then really launched in January, was to sound the alarm. And we have seen that many more people know about Project 2025. And as a result, starting in March, the Trump campaign started to get worried because even Republicans, when they find out about Project 2025 and they actually see the details, are not supportive of this agenda. And so it really built to the point where in June, after having kind of issued 2 or 3 directives to the Heritage Foundation and to advisory groups of Project 2025 to stop talking to the media, instead you had Kevin Roberts, who was the head of the Heritage Foundation, who went on and he talked about how it was moving forward and that in fact it was really a kind of second American Revolution and that it would be bloodless if people allowed it to be, sort of menacing the threat of potential violence even. And that kind of apparently was the straw that broke the camel's back for the Trump campaign because people started getting really upset. So where we are today is that we have seen out of 110 advisory groups, a number of major groups have technically not publicly announced this, but removed themselves from the advisory list. And of them, the most important to pay attention to is Stephen Miller's group, the America First group. And why is this so important? Partly because they're leading on a couple of fronts, one of them including being election integrity, which we're going to see the most action on in the next 2 months. But at the same time, we have learned that the pillars 2, 3, and 4 of Project 2025, which are the recruitment plan of bringing in all these, advisors, 20,000 advisors, putting them through an administrative kind of conservative administration course, and then getting ready for an actual implementation plan, which is a 180-day playbook. Those are all moving forward. And this week we learned that in media pressures and conversations with Kevin Roberts, that in fact, they have identified now 20,000 potential recruits. They've fully vetted about 11,000, but they're moving to having all vetted. And they are going through that course. And the course is being taught by a number of former Trump officials who also will be advisors to people if they get in office in each department. And most importantly, they've completed 150 executive orders at least, although they plan to have more ready. So they're putting in place the steps to implement this. And while the media focus is a little bit on, how much of a threat is this still going to be, and how much will, if the Trump campaign wins, how much will they implement this? We keep getting basically confirmation that this is very much a plan that is moving forward, and they're hoping to, take the media attention off of it. And what we must do as a result is to increase media attention on that. So which makes me pivot over to you and this rally that you just had in Times Square, Jay.
Well, yes, on July 27th, we had a really exciting rally in Times Square, right in front of the large electronic American flag at 43rd and Broadway, which we felt was very appropriate. Thanks to someone who's here in our audience today, Marina Thomas. And we got about 300 people showed up.
Fantastic.
Maybe 200 people saw it as a destination. And I think we probably got another 100 people that were simply passersby, tourists, locals going about their business who were attracted to the rally. We had a great array of speakers, 10, 11 different organizations, local. We mostly focused on issues concerning women, Black and Brown folks, and LGBTQ folks, and HIV/AIDS at the rally, and it came off very, very well. And it's interesting that our rally was held on Saturday the 27th, and the news broke about Paul Dans. That's the person who was demoted from being the project manager or whatever his title was at Project 2025. The news about him came out on Monday. So not just not to take too much credit, but the thing that the thing that those of us who are engaged in this fight need to be aware of, and I think that those of us who are actively working on it are absolutely aware of this, is that little bit of kabuki theater with Paul Dans was exactly that. It's theater. Project 2025 is a part of a now 45-year plan that the conservative movement in the United States has been pursuing essentially ever since Watergate. Watergate happened, Nixon went down in flames. The conservative Republican movement had to rebuild itself, rebrand itself, and figure out how to function. And the Heritage Foundation was born directly from that. And ever since then, every time a conservative president wins the presidential election, the Heritage Foundation already has prepared a mandate for leadership. They have submitted a mandate for leadership to every single conservative president ever since Ronald Reagan. And so this is what Project 2025 would be, is really sort of the culmination of all of that work that's been done. It's literally the sort of final nail in the coffin for our democracy. And so that's, like you said, AC, that's where it comes into play. What we are doing is we're not going to let them get away with the lie that somehow the policy work, it has concluded on Project 2025. Yeah, the policy work was concluded when the mandate for leadership document was finished. That's literally the policy work. That is the policy outline. And as you said, AC, they are writing executive orders feverishly to have them ready for the next conservative president. And so, so that's where we are. And what we are going to do to keep pushing is we are going to have a much, much larger rally in the nation's capital in Washington, D.C. on October 5th. It's a Saturday. Tentatively, we're scheduling it at 2 p.m. We have a committee that's working. We're reaching out to many large national organizations and highly visible people that are already doing active work, or at least voicing dissent about Project 2025. So our listeners to the podcast, our viewers of the podcast, should be aware of that. And reach out to us through our website, www.stopthecoup2025.org, if you'd like to get involved.
I think there's a couple of things too. One of the things that has happened this week is that there is a relatively new congressional caucus that is chaired by Representative Jared Huffman, as well as Jamie Raskin and some other folks in it. And they have made a request. I'm not exactly sure to whom they're requesting this, but it's certainly going to the Heritage Foundation. But at a higher level, they're demanding a public visibility on the 180-day plan, because their view is that if this is illegal, if this is an illegal plan, then it's not something that is going to be supported. And if it's legal, there shouldn't be any reason why the Heritage Foundation doesn't want to publish it. So it's really because of our concern of things that have been discussed. I mean, the Insurrection Act is not in the Project 2025 directly, but there's a lot of discussion that's taken place, even among advisory groups that are in Project 2025, members of the Heritage Foundation and others, about what kinds of actions you want to take in order to basically subvert the existing checks and balances, subvert the process in which Congress essentially has a process of vetting and selecting potential high-level political appointees or people in very high levels of decision-making. So I think we need to build, all of us, meaning not just our campaign, but all of our allies and civil society and others and people listening and calling their leadership and stuff, to say, we need to know what's in that 180-day playbook. Because that really is the concrete instruction for those 20,000 recruits to go in and essentially dismantle our system of government if there is if they do get a Republican president elected. In the meantime, there's some other things too, which is what we've seen is there's been a little bit more exposure in the media of some of the other groups that have not had so much attention, including private sector. So Hobby Lobby, for example, is one. There's a couple of others where we've seen large multinationals who are putting in large amounts of money into Project 2025. And we think it's really important that we also look at the money, because the money is the influence.
Mhm.
Finally, we want to look at election integrity, because we understand, and I think we ourselves have posted a little bit about this, and we'll do a little bit more in a recent newsletter, but there was another document that the Heritage Foundation was a co-author on. And it is a document that discusses this concept of election integrity. And what they did was they essentially worked with the Texas Public Policy Foundation, which is a right-wing think tank in Texas, and an academic who's in Texas, and they essentially did kind of intellectual exercises of what would it mean if suddenly the Republicans were losing during the election? What would be the steps to take? And what it really is a playbook for not respecting free elections and the different kinds of things. So it is essentially trying to put in place lessons that they learned from January 6th. And so we think this is also super important. We need to analyze it better. We need to talk about it. And we need to get the media to cover it. So those are immediate things that we do. And we're hoping to do some of that next week. We're going to the Democratic National Convention. We are not involved in the election. We're not supporting any particular candidates. That is not who we are. We're a 501c3. However, we are going to talk about Project 2025. And so I think that's really important. And we think that it's critical to continue raising awareness about this. And the last thing I'll say is, for people who haven't been to our website, we recently released a toolkit for community organizers to use, and it'll be available in Spanish and French very soon. And I think there is the piece that we've also talked about, Jay, which is, what do you do while you're sitting here waiting and thinking that maybe the shoe will drop? And we're going to go to the global context in a minute with Alan, but basically there's a lot you can do. So you need to talk about that, whether you're in your own, small organization, or you're in a coalition, or you're in a movement, to say, how might this affect me? And you have the blueprint. We can look and see how it might impact us wherever we are. Who else is impacted in your community? What are steps you can take? So we've provided both some of those pieces, the scenarios, the resources, the talking points, and also some concrete strategies for actually doing that analysis of your own vulnerability and what you might do now in preparation, whether it's a Democratic or a Republican who wins in November. The Christian nationalist movement is not stopping. They're advancing their agenda in the courts. We're seeing it every day. And we need to really take action, both in a preparatory way, a fighting way, and a kind of, thinking through intersectionally about how to mobilize our communities. So that's it. And then I'm really glad today that we're going to be introducing in a second Alan. But just to give you, I want to say just a little bit more on the Washington, D.C. What are some of the asks that you have of people who might be listening in organizations, Jay, for the D.C. action?
We've got asks out to the American Federation of Teachers, the ACLU DC. We've got asks out to numerous members of Congress. We are there's a bunch out. I don't have them in front of me, but if you are connected to a national organization that is a pro-democracy and anti-autocracy organization, and one that wants to preserve our Constitution and the way that our country functions, again, please reach out to us. If you'd like to, if your organization would like to sponsor this event, to be a part of it, it's going to be a very important event. It's taking place on October 5th again, 1 month before the election. It will feel that it's happening in DC will be a really strong way to make it very, very clear that Project 2025 is an ongoing threat, what the threat of Christian nationalism is across the country, what is happening right now. Because what AC just said is something that's really important to remember, that Project 2025 is about doing these fundamental changes to the federal government. However, these forces behind Project 2025, these 110 plus organizations that have been backing it, including the Heritage Foundation, have been doing this work at the state level, at the local level, in school boards, in city councils, in state legislatures, in governor's offices for years now. Every single ban on trans healthcare, every single attempt at banning drag shows, every attempt at banning books or stopping honest Black history. All of this is part and parcel of what Project 2025 is doing. They're basically doing test cases. And so it's important that we not only frame Project 2025, although very importantly, as this attack on the federal government and the way that it functions. The attack on the American people is ongoing, and it's happening right now, right here, today, in multiple places all over the country.
So what we're going to be doing today, I'm very excited, is we're also going to talk about the fact that Project 2025 is a global agenda. And that in fact, the planning for this has also been going on for 2 decades or more globally. The same actors who are allied with the advisory groups of Project 2025, groups like CFAM, and others, the Alliance Defending Freedom, these are groups who have been working to implement the same regressive, anti-gay, anti-woman, anti-diversity agenda across the world. And particularly, they've been targeting Africa, as we know, and part of it is via the lens of criminalization of LGBTQI folks, women who are seeking reproductive health services such as abortion. So I'm really pleased today that we're going to focus on that topic and welcome a colleague. We were together in Munich at the International AIDS Conference where we began to talk about this with other activists. There's a bunch of aspects, but just to say, one of the threats of Project 2025 in the big picture globally is that it calls for aligning all US policy, whether it's domestic or global, with a pro-life, as they call it, quote unquote, pro-life agenda, meaning that you will not be able to access US federal assistance, foreign assistance, as an organization or a government, whatever, unless you're willing to adhere to that policy. So unless you're willing to not give services to gay people, unless you're willing to not give services to transgender communities, unless you're willing to not serve women who might seek reproductive health services that could include abortion or possibly even some forms of birth control, you will not get support. And this is not in the health area. This is in all areas. So this is a massive shift of the possible agenda. And it includes specifically the expansion, the resurrection, the expansion of what we call the Mexico City Plan, the global gag rule for abortion. And it means that they would enforce it and you couldn't get money if you're going to do that. And it also is the beginning of what we're seeing in the US, we're starting to see globally, and we need to keep our eyes on and elevate in the public conversation, which is their desire to implement a global transgender gag or global gender ban. So with that said, I'm going to welcome Alan Maleche, who is the executive director of the Kenya Legal and Ethical Issues Network, Kellen, on HIV and AIDS. And we've just started talking together this past month. I'm delighted because he's really been leading some of the legal advocacy in Kenya. and across, sort of in a cross-sectoral way with other sectors in the human rights area. With his colleagues at Kellen, he has litigated landmark cases that have halted the forced sterilization of women living with HIV and stopped the unjust use of public health concerns as a reason to incarcerate people living with tuberculosis, and also prevented the government of Kenya from making the names of children living with HIV available to the public and more. So I think all of this kind of falls under the broad category of criminalization, which is what we're going to talk about today. Because part of what Project 2025 seeks to do is it weaponizes religion and it seeks to criminalize certain groups and polarize and divide society as a result. So Alan is also a former member of the Global Fund Board, which is one of the main organizations that funds HIV programs around the world. He represents the developing country NGOs. He has over a decade of experience in promoting ethical, human rights approaches to health planning, programming, and service delivery. And in 2018, Alan was awarded the Elizabeth Taylor Human Rights Award. He's a former fellow at the FXB Center for Health and Human Rights at the Harvard T.H. Chan School of Public Health. And he also holds a Bachelor of Laws from the University of Nairobi and a diploma in Gender and Human Rights from Uppsala University. So Alan, super big thanks for joining us tonight, especially because it's 12:30 in the morning, Nairobi time. So we're extra appreciative of your willingness to join us. And, what we're hoping to do today is have a kind of forward-looking conversation. But I have a bunch of questions for you, as you know, but I wanted to first start by just saying, for yourself, what is your sense of the global, in your circles of activism, what's your sense of the awareness of Project 2025 as something that is a threat to the global communities versus just a US plan?
Thank you, AC, for having me, and Greg. This best way to start my Friday morning with a very important conversation around a topic that is extremely critical for all of us. Yes, as you mentioned, I do work a lot extensively on issues related to gender equality, sexual and reproductive health rights, and the protection of vulnerable communities in Kenya and globally. But today's discussion is crucial because we are witnessing a coordinated global effort, particularly through what you're talking about, projects or initiatives like Project 2025, which are seeking to roll back progress in these areas. And this is not just a local issue for the US, it's actually a global challenge that has implications for Kenya and for the broader African region. Now, in specific response to your question, I think the observation we have made is that there is not much awareness around what Project 2025 is, at least within the circles of either lawyers, judges, healthcare workers, civil society activists in the Kenyan and African context. And that is because it hasn't been clearly broken down to them around what that challenge likely looks like. And so the work that Stop the Project 2025 is doing, the work organizations such as the Strategic Issues and Research Council in East Africa that is really helping cross the T's and I's on who's doing what and trying to provide information. And a number of lawyers, including two friends of mine, Barney and Sam Kialo, who have actually made it their lifelong goal to educate lawyers in the global south around what does this mean, especially in the context of the global gag rule. So the level of awareness is low, I would say, because if people understood the implications of Project 2025, there would be more outrage and more concern around some of the things you're going to talk about today on this podcast in terms of how certain right-wing religious fundamentalists and anti-gender and anti-rights movements are really penetrating states, governments, parliamentarians, and even judiciaries to be able to influence them to go in a direction where they are making reversals on important issues. So, AC, I really feel there's much more that needs to be done to get this work going. And I do hope that when we're done with this webinar, we'll then be able to also disseminate it as widely as possible, but including the important tools that you've developed under your project. The toolkits are really important. So back
Yeah.
to you.
Well, I think before we talk about the history of the organizing that's taken place in Kenya and other things by the Christian right and how it's linked to Project 2025, you have such a rich professional biography. So I wanted to maybe just tell us a little bit about how you came to be at Kellen and maybe what are some of its priority missions.
Great. So my story with Carolyn is a very long story. It started off with my second year of law school when the Carolyn organization came to the Faculty of Law and was looking for young law students who would be willing to go and carry out legal aid clinics to speak to people living with HIV about their rights. And this was at the time when there was a lot of stigma about HIV. And so there are very few lawyers and people who wanted to be associated with it. And I took interest in going to the legal aid clinics, and I found the connection between the law, HIV was quite important. And that's how I got into Kellyn as a young law student, and eventually went through to get my law degree and eventually get admitted to the bar. And I worked a lot in a professional law firm in the private sector, but that particular law firm had a soft spot for people living with HIV and would provide free legal services and legal training. And so through my 7 years at the law firm, I was able to grasp the legal knowledge around these issues. And when the opportunity presented itself at Kellyn to lead their programs, I eventually joined them. Began off with a small budget of $25,000 from the Open Society Foundation. And eventually we have grown now. Miles and Bonds and now I'm the executive director. But largely what has gotten me here is mostly the appreciation that as lawyers, we have the ability to help in using the law to be able to safeguard the rights of those who are vulnerable or generally human beings who feel oppressed by systems, processes. And so that's what I strive to do at Kellyn. Our mission is health for all. We want to ensure that everyone is able to access rights. And we are seeking to promote, protect, and ensure that rights are respected for everybody. So that's what we do. And our mantra is we're reclaiming rights and we are rebuilding lives. And that's exactly what I live for.
Well, I think a lot of people who certainly in the US, we've had a lot of press coverage in these past 2-3 years about what's happening in Uganda with the Anti-Homosexuality Act. And there's a kind of slight awareness among people really paying attention that you've been exploitation of these legal templates for criminalizing of homosexuality. And that these are now kind of being created as copycat laws. And so I want to just give people a little bit of a sense about what's happening in Kenya and stuff. But I also want to talk about, let's frame this Christian right movement and its attack a little bit and try to understand what are the conditions, like if we take Kenya example, what are the conditions that would allow these kind of religious white supremacists from the United States to come in and begin to have such an influence on the law of another country or the policies of another country. Can you talk a little bit about Kenya in that way?
So great. I think in Kenya, we have an extremely progressive constitution, which is very clear that there's no state religion, which means we are neither Christian, Muslim, or Hindu country. We are basically secular. But a large percent of the population is Christian, then Muslim and Hindu and other religions. And so the churches have a lot of influence and have a lot of money in the process. And so many political campaigns are largely run alongside churches or through churches where people have a lot of access to audiences and have a lot of support. And because many are Christians, would resonate to leaders who, for lack of a better word, claim to be God chosen or have strong links to the church. And so for that reason, we have seen a situation where the church has become an avenue where everyone is able to try and use religion as a way of connecting with political leaders. And this is what we are exactly seeing. And in this case, we are seeing a number of evangelists, a number of individuals working closely with evangelists that are now using this angle to be able to access various high-level officials in government. And so it is through the angle of we are Christians, we have certain Christian values, and because of these values, we resonate with you because you are also, in quotes, a God-fearing leader, and as such, we want to associate with you. And so it is this avenue that is being exploited by people like Valerie Huber, who is a former staff of the Trump administration and also the person and the brains behind the Geneva Consensus Declaration. Even post-Trump, this has been someone who has continued to be a big crusader of this crazy document that they came up with in Geneva and trying to move around different countries, Chad, South Sudan, Burundi, and also we'll talk about briefly on Sharon Slater, Family Watch, but generally AC, the ability of people to use religion to navigate various spaces, the judiciary, the parliament, the presidency and key executives is very worrying, and we have seen it a lot on various media platforms, and this connection makes it extremely blurry in terms of what then they push forward. And in the case of Kenya, we have a constitution that has got very clear rights, and so the moment you bring in religious values that don't align to our constitution, then we have a problem, and that's the current problem we are facing now.
I want to give people a little bit of context for what we're seeing in Kenya by going back to maybe like the 1990s. And I think, Jay, you'll be familiar with this too, where, in Uganda, all the way back in 2009 is the first time we saw the introduction of the actual Anti-Homosexuality Act in kind of a different version. And it didn't go through then. There was a huge amount of resistance. And then again in 2012, and what we started seeing was particularly groups like Family Watch International, which is led by Sharon Slater and her husband, and the groups, the World Congress of Families, which is a far-right group, a lot of influence. And we know that they went to, not only did they go to these countries like Uganda and others and met with African pastors, but as you say, they've really courted the leadership, and particularly through the UN. This is where CFAM has got consultative status at the UN and has been hosting, this African breakfast for evangelicals, using the World Breakfast every year to bring together and share this. And so, there have been journalists who have been tracking this. We've seen some documentation of the money, but we know that there's a lot of dark money that's flowing through because they're going to churches who do not have to reveal their money. They don't have to file 990s. I mean, they should, but they don't. And so this is also another thing. And then they're, of course, using this incredibly powerful network of Christian broadcasters to really get this message across. So they're kind of bypassing the usual structures to really mobilize in churches. But I know that with, the anti-gay bill, the Anti-Homosexuality Act in Uganda, when it was passed, has led to a horrible backlash against LGBTQI people. They have been evicted from their homes. They've been subjected to, a state-sanctioned kind of persecution. There have been vigilante mobs. And the other piece of it, which I think is critical for Kenya too, is they have mobilized civil society to reject any engagement because they've made it be a crime, essentially, to provide a service to a person who is LGBTQI, or, for example, to give them a service such as a housing. So people are getting evicted. They're not allowed to even be giving refuge. And so, this has a huge impact, not just for families, but for all the organizations that normally were serving these communities. So, I'm just saying this is the context, right, that we have for what's happened. So I wanted to know if you could just tell me a little bit about what's happened in Kenya, where there was really about 2 years ago was when we started to really hear more and more about a copycat bill and what's happened with it. And, I mean, I want to get to the bill, but I also want to know, like, who's pushing this in Kenya. You know, what do we know about the evangelicals in Kenya? What do you know, or what do you want to know?
Well, that we could speak all day, but let me start off with saying that there has been a drive, and particularly I will go back to the issue around Sharon Slater Family Watch, and she has deep collaborations with local groups here in Kenya, Nigeria, and Uganda. And in Kenya, she specifically works with an entity called the Kenya Christian Professionals Forum that brings together all Christians from different professions, legal, medical, and these are people who are largely pushing aspects based strongly on religious values, and they have funded many of the campaigns like Marching for Life campaigns, and Family Watch International, as many audiences would know, and as you very well know, AC, has been behind the letter by, and we'll talk about this again, by African leaders to Congress in June, threatening the reauthorization of PEPFAR. But specific to the question around the LGBTI laws, this has largely stemmed from, again, a convening done for parliamentarians and religious leaders who were part of the group that pushed for the Ugandan law, and a number of Kenyan parliamentarians, particularly one called Peter Kaluma, was part of this meeting, and he's part of the people that then pushed forward a copycat bill from the Ugandan one, which is now called the Kaluma Bill, that has now been presented, or yet to be formally presented to Parliament for discussion. But it's basically a bill that is literally copying a lot of aspects of the Ugandan bill by trying to criminalize people, for how they dress, how they present themselves, and again trying to come up with more stringent provisions of criminal punishment against the LGBTIQA plus community. The bill is yet to move through Parliament, but the strategy that is being used is to keep throwing a few things to the media to sort of gaslight the public around this particular law and to drive hate against the people. I want to go specific to the fact that a few months, not a few months, it's actually been about 6 or so months, we had a very significant decision by the Supreme Court of Kenya. And I want to use this example so that the audience can see how this works. And the Supreme Court of Kenya issued a ruling in late 2023 about the refusal of a non-governmental coordination board to register an association with the name LGBTQ phrase in its governance documents. And basically what the court said is that anyone who wants to form a non-governmental organization is allowed to do so by way of freedom of association if they are also focusing on issues of non-discrimination on ground of sex, which is covered in our constitution, then that is in line. Of course, it was not the entire Supreme Court, it was 3-2 decisions, so a bench of 5. And so this was a resounding victory because the Supreme Court is the final court in the country. And basically what it said, yes, LGBTIQs or organizations can organize to be able to advocate around things in the Constitution like the right to health, the right to non-discrimination, the right to freedom of speech for everyone, including LGBTIQ. And so when this decision passed, it was very fundamental and very important. But what did the churches do? The churches then took this decision to their various pulpits on the next Sunday and basically said that the Supreme Court had legalized same-sex marriages by this
it worked
particular
to
decision.
organize them. Yeah.
And that is the disinformation and misinformation they used to drive hatred among Kenyans, saying, why are then the judges in the Supreme Court importing, in quotes, laws from the US and other places. And that then was the narrative that was used to drive the conversation, which then triggered violence against LGBTI communities. We saw clinics being closed, we saw people's lives being threatened, we saw people being attacked, and largely coming then. Now, if you're proposing that you're driving Christian values, I don't believe Christian values require you to spread lies. Christian values don't require you to harm other people, but that is exactly the tactic that they use to say
Yeah.
anything a government institution does that seeks to be seen to be promoting the LGBTI community, then they have legalized that. And that's why then we need this strong law to come into place so that it can stop. And ridiculously, the parliamentarian Peter Kaluma, who was never a party to this case, actually filed a case before the Supreme Court to challenge the Supreme Court's decision. And it was very hilarious because the Supreme Court actually kicked out their case and said they know the Supreme Court does not sit on appeal on its own decision, and him as a lawyer ought to know that is not a right procedure. So they actually condemned him to pay costs personally for instituting that particular lawsuit. But it shows you the ridiculousness of how a professional would actually do something unprofessional just to get the clout and just to drive a point home that doesn't make sense at all. So that's the connection around how the evangelists and the religious groups work in terms of.
I think there's also this aspect that I think is specific. Well, it's certainly specific to Uganda with the Museveni, but in Kenya, you have President Ruto.
Correct.
And we know that in order to be able to be elected, he deliberately courted the evangelical vote, right? This began, I don't know, maybe many years ago.
Yes.
And that he has a partner, a wife, who is also quite religious. And he has, I think, a deputy, right, whose partner is a born-again pastor. So I think what's critical is that we have to also look at it in the sense of like, who is what is the use of this this kind of evangelical bloc? And in Kenya and in Uganda, it's to give legitimacy and power to political leaders who are themselves actually being challenged. I mean, Museveni was being challenged with charges of corruption. And so he was able to kind of use this issue of criminalizing of LGBT to gain a lot of support, to kind of show himself as a person of the people and stuff. And I think it's incredible that we have to be able to focus on the way in which these things are being used by African leaders. It's not just the American evangelicals. Both sides are using this for their own reasons. And we need to make the connections between them, as well as the money. Project 2025 has groups in there, like I said, who have been financing all these African pastors in lots of different ways. They have conferences, they show up and suddenly are driving fancy automobiles, and there's very little transparency. What we see is these meetings are happening. And in cases like Uganda, you end up with pictures like, I think the Slaters were shown meeting Janet Museveni, just as this law passed. But we also saw the Slaters presenting at a Pan-African Congress on how to do this kind of legal criminalization. And, what was interesting about that one is I think it was IPAS was the one who might have revealed this story. It was an investigative story that showed that the Slaters actually registered under fake names. They used their middle names and their not even their married names in order to try to hide the fact that they were presenting. So they know that they're doing something that a lot of people are opposed to. But I just think it's important to see the political context, because it's a political goal here, and it's a political goal for African countries as well as for the Christian right countries, right? So the African evangelicals have a goal, but then the politicians have another goal.
And Alan, I just have I want to ask you a couple of questions, just sort of relative questions. First one is it solely the specifics of the Kenyan Constitution that is kind of the only bulwark between this sort of rise of this legislative hatred Or are there other differences that you see between, say, Kenya and Uganda that have stopped it from rising as much as it rose in Uganda? Like, are there differences in the relative stability, the
Can you hear Alan?
Yeah. So that's the first question. I would just like to hear, because we know that, like, Kenya seems to has been resisting somewhat. South Africa's been resisting. Other countries, Uganda hasn't. Ghana just managed to get over on it. So I'm just curious about what you see as the differences, and what lessons maybe you have learned from the countries where these Christian nationalists, these evangelicals, have managed to be successful, that are helping you in your fight in Kenya.
So thanks for that, and a very important question. I think I'll start off by saying that, of course, having a very strong constitution that makes clear separation between the executive, parliament, and the judiciary is important, but most relevant is having a constitution that spells out what are the rights of everyone and what are the rights that need to be respected. Now, what has been fundamentally different for Kenya is that we have a very robust judiciary that is required to be able to uphold and defend the constitution. And so that becomes our bedrock that we possibly fall to. But we are also taken through the same narrative of parliamentarians introducing laws or policies, having to go to parliament and make submissions and try to push back. But at the end of the day, when you're competing with Sharon Slater and Valerie, who are pumping a lot of money and flying these politicians elsewhere, the bills are likely to pass at that particular level. And then when you have an executive that is captured in the sense that we currently have both the first lady and the second lady, who's a pastor, have actually hired prayer warriors on a government budget line. I don't know what their terms of reference are, but you have that level of influence of people having a level of unnecessary expenditure. And again, we have seen them, especially the first lady, championing something called the family protection policy, which was something again that was driven by the Kenya Christian professionals through the Conference of Catholic Bishops to really push for this particular policy. So again, when you come to this particular policy, you then, of the family protection and promotion policy, you then find them having that influence there. So we also have that challenge at the executive and parliament level that Uganda is facing, but our biggest difference is the ability to know the constitution allows citizens to demonstrate, allows citizens to be able to go to court. And I think you've seen with the upright of the Gen Z movement in Kenya being able to push back on the finance oppression that is happening, on the ability of people to have a renewed spirit. So that's what makes it different. And for our colleagues in Uganda, it's a difficult task because all three arms of government are not very independent from the experience we've seen. Sometimes the judiciary tries to be bold, but they get pushed back by the executive in a manner that's difficult. And then what has evolved in Ghana has been very interesting in terms of pushback coming through from an argument about the economic angle of taking forward an anti-LGBTI law and what that means for the country. But also, respectfully, the Ghanaian president has been a human rights lawyer and has been in civil movement for a while. So I wouldn't foresee him signing the bill. We are still seeing this springing up in Malawi and elsewhere, and that remains a going concern. So I think the lesson I would say we've learned here is we have to track, we have to know where these bills are being sponsored. We have to find parliamentarians who see reason and can push back. We have to keep calling out our executive when they're doing things that are not constitutional, things that are undermining human rights in the name of Christian or religious values, and being able to document this. And eventually, when all else fails, we have to get ready to litigate and see what the courts would have to say about this issue. And being able to ensure you have the right lawyers, you have the right clients, you've got a judiciary that understands these issues and can make independent decisions is something that is fundamental, but unfortunately, it's not work that is being funded. So you have got very little pockets of people in Africa who are able to understand, litigate, and take these cases forward. And yet there's no donor who is willing to fund this on a broader and larger scale, or even just help convene, bring lawyers from different regions, because these laws are not only in Africa, there are also some in Eastern Europe. We're seeing what's happening in the US. And so the spread of the evangelic group is quite big, and we need to think through how do we counter this. I hope that
I
has
mean, that's certainly
given you
something
some
we've talked
context.
about
I
doing,
just
you
had
know,
a
we're
follow-up
hoping to
question
convene the lawyers and the lessons.
I
Um,
just had a quick
you know,
follow-up question.
did you have a follow-up question, Jay?
Can you hear me? Yeah, just a quick follow-up, because the one thing that you brought up is, Alan, was, you know, the pastor is going into the church the next day, or, you know, the following Sunday, and talking about how, you know, how they're, you know, this imported LGBTQ stuff, blah, 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 blah. And we've heard this all for years about the way that this argument is phrased in Africa. How do these white evangelicals who come across the ocean from the United States with all these policies that they essentially dictate to these governors, like, how are they not being characterized as colonizers? How are they, like, how is it boggles my mind, Alan. It boggles my mind. And so I'd love to hear you just about that for a second.
Just real quick, I think that's one has been the talking points that people have greatly used to say. You cannot be having a meeting with Sharon Slater and Valerie Huber and even people like Don Feder of the Ruth Institute, and then you come and say that this is an African bill, this is an African law with African values, yet the person who drafted it was definitely not African. And we know it because sometimes when you take the parliamentarians to task about what is in the law, some of them cannot explain it. And so this is some of the debunking that needs to be able to be done by many people working on these issues to show that there is financial interest that is happening, because when people go for these expensive conferences, they get paid to move the bills. And so there's financial interest. And unfortunately, the evangelical groups, as AC said, face very little regulation about their sources of financing and how they use it. And there's been a great pushback in Kenya, where churches and religious institutions are pushing back to declare their taxes and to be able to be held accountable. And so these are the things we have to unpeel and unmask, but definitely it's all financial motivation. It's all driven by hatred under the false pretense that we want to save our families, we want to promote Christian values, and we want the family to fit a certain particular unit. And so that's the driving force. And that's what we have to be able to unpack, expose, and name and shame as is happening in different places.
On that ground, I mean, what is happening with civil society? I mean, there's a pro and a con. You know, we've seen that one of the arguments that people make is that, you know, as you said, so much of Kenyans are actually very family oriented, very Christian. They don't support LGBT rights. They may not be very familiar, but they're being presented with a very you know, demonizing kind of narrative and things to make them afraid, like, you know, under the guise of, you know, protecting children and things. But what's happening with civil society, and what are your views about what works to try to bring forward more of an intersectional response from civil society? Because with Project 2025 as a good example, you know, we're not just looking at an attack on LGBTQ people, we're looking at a set of principles that will affect every aspect of the Kenyan economy in the way that it intersects or has is in any way taking money from the United States. I mean, it's basically saying to them, you're going to impose this pro-life agenda or you're not going to get money from us. So I'm just wondering what kind of Yeah, what are you seeing with civil society, and what have you found that might work or could work, or you're thinking about in terms of an intersectional response, so that it's really showing how the attack is unfolding in Kenya?
Thanks, and I just want to go back to Greg real quick and say there's actually a tweet which we'll look for and I'll share with you, where Peter Kaluma actually has a book that is being presented to him by Sharon Slater, saying he's now gotten the book and he's gonna read it and spread the evil across the world. So that's the irony of it. Like there's a clear sponsor. But to Ace's question, I think intersectionality is extremely important. And we witnessed this in a number of ways, at least in Kenya, but we've also seen it in other African countries. The folks fighting the LGBTI community in court are the same folks fighting anti-abortion laws, are the same folks fighting vaccination during COVID time. And so from the side of the anti-rights, anti-gender, evangelical kind of Christian pushing level, they are consistent in their pushback. And in the case of Kenya, it is normally specific lawyers, specific organizations, specific medical doctors who are the experts. And so they cut across. But when you come to civil society, we've got those who are working on only LGBTIQ issues, those who are only working on abortion issues, those who are working a bit on health issues and vaccination. And there's been not as much coordination as we desire to be able to happen across folks from the board. And it's not only those working on these three issues, but also thinking around those who work on civil rights issues, thinking about those who work on femicide issues, and thinking about those who work on aspects that deal with freedom of association and good governance, and to help them see that this is an attack on the Constitution. And I think one of the challenges we see is that there are very few donors that are willing to fund across intersections, across movements, and also willing to get organizations to just even convene from different sectors and different areas to understand what is going on. And so that's the biggest gap I see. It's because people are then fighting this alone or fighting it in caucuses that they are familiar to. So they become easy to be able to push back and isolate. But when we come more in numbers, we have then seen the ability of that to happen. So the instance we had in Kenya is that we had a lot of murders happening for sex workers by their clients early this year. And so those are march that was organized. And this march was looking at it from a femicide perspective, that you cannot be killing women, whether they are LGBTI, whether they are sex workers, whether they are straight women or cisgender women. That was the march, and everyone came across, whether they were male, female, trans, to say, this is wrong, this is not supposed to be happening. Of course, our head of state did not join the march or did not even say a word about it. Neither did the first lady, nor did the deputy. And you'd think if you had Christian values, the right to life is so precious, you'd say something about it, but they didn't. But then you've got such a movement coming in together. So one of the things I'd really hope whoever is listening to this podcast and is trying to think through as a civil society person is look out for other folks. Look out for the feminists who are working on this. Look out for the folks working on civil rights. Look out for folks who are working on health broadly. Get out of the abortion cocoon, get out of the LGBTI cocoon, and start reaching out to people and trying to sell this issue to them for them to be able to see. Secondly, for us, at least in Kenya, litigation has been extremely helpful in terms of stopping some of the ridiculous laws, stopping some of the ridiculous policies, but also just putting the anti-rights, anti-gender movement to task around very ridiculous laws. So that has been a very important avenue for us. The third one has definitely been the media. The ability of the media to get spaces where they bring together both the anti-rights groups and the folks working on human rights issues, and having a moderated conversation that is well balanced and tries to call out this is important. And so I've had colleagues appearing on TV shows to be able to do so, and that helps debunk the myth around what people are driving around. So for me, those are the three things I've seen. And again, I just want to emphasize that is important. And I also want to mention a fourth thing that has been extremely important for us. I mentioned an organization called the Strategic Issues and Research Council, which is based in East Africa. It's quite an important organization for us because it's doing more of what you're doing in Stop Project 2025 around tracking, getting us to have information around what is going on and who is being funded to do what particular work.
It's a monitoring organization, right?
Exactly. Yeah, it's really monitoring and trying to provide intel that is sound based on what the law says, and that intel is important. And so we need such organizations to be supported. We need such individuals to be supported so that this information is good. And I think you saw the report that you mentioned that showed how money was moving from the US and other places to Africa and to particular organizations that were being used to destabilize the projects that have been made. So I think for me, those four aspects are important around A, get people to work across intersections, B, support litigation, C, work with the media to get the general public to understand what the real issues are and make debates based on real issues and not misinformation. And of course, for support organizations that monitor, collect intel, and are able to ensure that people have access to critical information.
I want to ask you about a couple of different things with turning back to Project 2025. I mean, you know, the other day you and I were on a forum with Alexei from Russia, and he was talking about the criminalization there that has affected not only LGBTQ groups, but foreign NGOs trying to work on those issues and everyone being criminalized. And to the point where when you're underground, trying to survive underground, you can't work in the same way. You can't put an you can't put in a rainbow flag on your organization. You can't even identify as LGBTQ. You can't sign a petition globally. So you can't even work in the same ways to try to raise awareness or do advocacy. And I'm just wondering, you know, what are you seeing in Kenya, and what are the kind of forms of resistance that you think are successful, or some of the lessons that people are bringing for survival? Because I think that's really one of the kind of human intelligence, the actual experience of people who are being targeted and how they're surviving and what they need. I think that's what we need here to know about, and we need to share and amplify. There's a lot of intelligence and leadership coming from Uganda and Tanzania and Ghana, where the most criminalized people are being forced to be creative in how they survive. And also, you know, like as an example with Russia, you know, he was saying that one of the groups that they never worked with before would be environmental groups, because environmental issues are not considered such hot button issues the way that gender or homosexuality is, or abortion. So they can work more easily without getting the attention of government. And so making these alliances for them is it's a new activity. It's a new strategic activity. It allows them for, you know, pooling money or thinking about getting resources. You know, those groups might have a warehouse, whereas an LGBT group may not be able to have a warehouse. So things like that, that are really about surviving and resisting under criminalization. So what are you seeing in Kenya?
So thanks. I think I'll start with the sector that I'm very familiar with, which is the HIV sector that I've been in for many decades. And I think the first step that was taken by many folks who run LGBTI or clinics for gay men, trans people to get health services, particularly HIV services, the ability to get buy-in from the community around the services they provide and how important they are has been extremely critical because of their existence. And where they have been attacked, we have seen instances where they have actually reported some of these attacks to the police, because the police then have an obligation to investigate and find out who has undertaken that particular attack. Secondly, I have seen the LGBTI community and those who are working on HIV issues and also SRHR issues actually going to court to seek orders, and they have been successful in a county called Mombasa to stop politicians from, and even religious leaders from driving hate speech, because we had a period of time where religious leaders would call out and say, on Friday, we are going to march to this clinic because it's attending to gay people and they're promoting homosexuality. Of course, they're not promoting homosexuality. They are providing HIV services that are needed to the entire population, but sometimes their clinics are tailor-made for certain communities to get tailor-made services, as our constitution requires that everyone has a right to health, and health has to be available, affordable, acceptable, and of good quality. And so we've seen successful court orders that have stopped religious leaders and parliamentarians from issuing threats and hate speech. And so that has been a very positive step. We've seen great solidarity with people who run safe houses to try and ensure that in times of when there's heightened threat of security, then people are moved away. And then we have an active network of human rights defenders in Kenya who not only work on civil and political rights issues, but have also been at the forefront of trying to help provide safety and security measures for organizations that are likely to be under attack when there's a court decision, when there's a rant by a parliamentarian, when there's an uproar around these particular issues. And so those are some of the things we see. But I also have seen, and learning from the Ugandan experience, a lot of resilience and solidarity among the civil society groups and also even professionals in various sectors who are willing to fundraise, willing to source fund or crowd fund to be able to get people to be attended to. And then lastly, there's also been solidarity with healthcare workers who are very quick to provide healthcare services in circumstances where people have been attacked, people need that particular care. And so it's been in different shapes and forms, sometimes not sufficient, but at least being able to do that. And of course, lastly, creating a safe space where people can speak and talk about these things without being monitored and being able to ensure they're checking on each other's well-being and they're being safe, especially from intruders or infiltrators who are trying to pretend they're LGBTI but are there for intelligence gathering and trying to use that to address issues. So a multiple number of things, but highly proud of the ability of the LGBTI community, the SRHR community, to really coordinate and fight back against some of these crazy
We have
and
about,
irrational behaviors.
Actually, AC, I want to do a time check.
yeah, I was doing the
Because we
same. We
want
have
to
about 10
get
minutes
some
left.
questions in if you have.
So I
Wow,
thought
time flies.
we
Yeah.
should talk about Project 2025 in the sense of, when you and I met, we talked about the need for trying to maybe consider a global rapid response network, primarily to do things like bring together and bring forward the lessons of grassroots communities, bring together lawyers who are on the front lines, whether they're in Eastern Europe and Africa or Latin America or in authoritarian countries, to share the lessons. But all of this is a lot about preparedness, right? So as you're thinking about these next 2 months, you're looking at the US, you're seeing what might happen or not with PEPFAR. What are some of the things that you would like to see? And also I wanted you just to talk about, before we close our session here, what international solidarity looks like for you, what works, and what you might want from us, for example, here in the US. I mean, we're having this conversation, but what kinds of things would you like to see or could you imagine?
Well, AC, the first one is very simple. I think I want to imagine a victory of a presidential candidate who upholds rights, respects people, and is able to drive human rights values and spread the rights message across the globe. And I definitely know the current person running for the Republican seat would not do that. So on the first request, it's definitely up to you guys with the voters cards in the US to be able to save us from 4 years of misery. We have experienced it before alongside you, and we're not ready to experience it again. And I think you now have very promising candidates. And as I said at the AIDS conference, in a number of sessions I spoke to, that to all my American friends, I am holding you accountable on your ability to turn things around, because we are currently in a world where the space is shrinking We have a lot of right-wing governments in Europe and elsewhere, and so we need to get that happening. Secondly, in terms of what does solidarity look like, I think many allies who fund this work really need to redesign their grant making, make it as flexible as possible, and make it accessible, especially to many organizations in the global south, because there's a lot of preparedness that is needed so that we can avoid a reactory aspect. The evangelical groups have actually been investing a lot of time in this, and it's time we started claiming our space back, because these attacks are becoming more regional. They are becoming less about a country. And so it's important for us to be able to ensure that we take this forward. And I know we are pressed for time, so let me conclude by basically saying what you mentioned and what you talked about in Munich is we definitely need to find different ways to bring different people from different continents and from different countries to talk about this particular issue. But I just want to say as we wrap up that I'd just really like to stress the urgency of this moment, because the threats we are facing are real and growing, but so is our resolve to fight back. And it's essential that we remain vigilant and continue to push back against these regressive forces. And in terms of global solidarity, my urge to everyone listening is to stay informed, support organizations including Kelin or SAC or any other organization in your region that speaks out against the efforts to undermine human rights in Kenya, beyond. And for me, I really believe with this kind of conversations and with global solidarity, we can make the difference that is needed. Back to you guys.
Thank you, Alan. Thank
Jay,
you.
I'm gonna give you the last word here.
Everyone just started applauding in the room here, so we're gonna go with that. Because you deserve the applause, you deserve all the flowers.
Thank you.
And I just wanted, since we actually did end up with an audience, we did this today at 5 p.m. because we didn't want to ask Alan to get onto a podcast at 2 a.m. Kenya time. So we didn't expect to have folks in our audience, but we did end up with a few folks in our audience. So I just wanted to ask if anyone before
Oh,
we
yes,
start the
please.
podcast, I did want to ask if anyone had any questions or comments about what you've heard today. If not, I'll turn it back over to AC. No question? Okay. Oh, yes, go ahead. Ma'am in the front.
Maybe you could
I'll repeat
relay
it.
the
I'll repeat
question.
it.
So I would like to hear more about the ways that gender and LGBTQIA issues are being linked, because they are, right? But I'm not hearing that in the conversation. That is that the kind of anti-abortion stuff and the misogyny is going side by side with the anti-LGBTQIA attacks. And I want to see how that conversation is happening, to bring them together, to see them as two parts of the same thing.
So the question was about, I guess to Alan, about what are ways to find common cause between the groups that are fighting the attacks on gender and the groups that are fighting the attacks on LGBTQIA. Are there efforts in Kenya to bring, to bring those groups together and recognize that they're fighting a common foe, not just they both happen to be in battle, but that it's literally the same people are attacking, both communities?
Great question, and I just want to say yes, there are very consistent efforts among folks working on anti-abortion issues. There's been a lot of challenges by the religious fundamentalists pushing back on very progressive abortion laws, pushing back on SRHR laws that are very progressive in providing comprehensive sexuality education to young people, and promoting things like the family protection policy that are regressive. And so we've actually, as Kelin, gone to court with young people who are living with HIV. We've gone to court with feminists to challenge the family protection policy, to say that some of the provisions are regressive to women, to young people, including lesbian people, because it limits their ability to seek certain forms of treatment. And so there's definitely that particular connection. And there's also conversations happening between folks working on gender work, folks working on anti-abortion work or SRHR generally, and the LGBTI community. I know it didn't come out very much in the conversation, but we actually have live litigation in Kenya challenging the family protection policy that was passed as a result of the push of the Kenyan Christian professionals, of course, with the support of Family Watch International and others. And so we do see those connections and people are alive to them in terms of doing so, but also I mentioned the issue around femicide, where sex workers were getting killed by their clients in apartments, and the ability of the women's movement to rally behind the sex workers and also the LGBTI movement to join through and say every life matters and people should stop getting killed. So quite a number of examples, but always happy to connect over email and share more if time allows. Over.
Great.
Thank
I
you,
just wanted to
Alan.
mention to folks that we're going to continue this conversation with Kellen, but also we have our next podcast is going to be on September 12th. And we have tentatively confirmed Edwin Bernard, who is with the justice organization, a justice organization working on criminalization. We're hoping that he will also participate. And so we wanted to invite those of you who are listening. Certainly, if you haven't yet had a chance to go to our website and read some of the materials, we have a paper on global HIV, which really talks about the potential cutting of the US funding and its impacts. We have the papers on climate and others, obviously on LGBTQ. And then also we are going to be doing a little bit more work. So if you're interested, we have a newsletter. That's where we tell people about when these when these podcasts are happening. We'll be having 2 in September. And we're going to basically continue to work and mobilize. And I'm very excited to be working with Alan and Jay and others to really see how we can develop not just the global solidarity in terms of a network, but bringing forward lessons and things that we'll be sharing on our website in our resources as well. So for me, I just want to say thank you so much, Alan. We're going to work hard and work quickly, and I'm excited about this work. I think it's critically important. I agree with you about the funding. It's tough with Project 2025 because people see it as a very political issue. And even though we're a 501c3 and it's not partisan for us, it's about a movement, right? A Christian right movement. It's challenging. And so we really do invite folks who are in the donor community to think about that. We're seeking support. We need to work. We have a huge amount of I think information that we need to get out. And as we started this broadcast, we talked about how the awareness in the global community is growing, but it is still small, and it needs to be brought forward by activists in those countries to their communities. And so we just want to let them know that we have content on our website for them to take and be able to help them broker the conversations with the communities as they know best and in local contexts. So thank you so much for joining us today. And Jay, I'm going to give you the last word here.
Thank you, AC, and thank you, Alan. I really, really appreciated everything that you had to say. It was very, very good to get the take of someone living in Kenya about the struggles that that are happening globally. And I want to remind all of our listeners today and all of our viewers today that this does not stop on November 5th. Let's just say that the conservative presidential candidate does not win. This work cannot end. This, like we've talked about, this exporting of just rabidly right-wing, hate-mongering Christianist agendas. It has been happening for decades. We need to do the work here to stop it where it's coming from, which is right here. But we also need to join common cause with our friends in Europe and in Africa and in South America and everywhere where we see, because that is really a global movement, and we need a global movement to combat it. And even just here locally in the United States, if the conservative candidate for president does not win, we have to make sure that our Congress gets bills passed and bills get signed into law to make sure that it becomes impossible for the things that are possible right now, the things that they want to do in Project 2025 are possible. They can be done if the next conservative president gets elected. There are ways to use our legislative processes to make that impossible. And we need to push our legislators to do it. And that's going to take a lot of work, and that's going to take a lot of people, and that's going to take a lot of organizations, and that's going to take a lot of money. And to that end, putting on a rally on October 5th is going to take a lot of money. And so, listeners, viewers, if you go to www.stopthecoup2025.org, you will see a donation button. We appreciate any support that you can get. As AC mentioned, we are a 501c3 sponsored organization sponsored by the Metropolitan Community Church of New York, which means that donations are tax deductible. The donations go to Gen Democracy, come through our fiscal sponsor, and so they are tax deductible. So please press that donate button and help us continue this fight. And thank you everybody for watching and listening.
Thank you so much.
Thank you, Alan.
Thank you.
And get some sleep.
Right away, guys. Thank you, and let's continue the fight. Bye-bye.
Keep the
Good night,
fight.
everybody.
That's right.
Thank you.
Good night, everyone.
Good night.